Good morning, good morning.
네, 스턴, 안녕하십니까. 지금 시각이 런던에서는 아침 8시라고 합니다만 이런 시간에 저의 대화 요청에 응해 주셔서 감사합니다. 지금 런던의 날씨는 어떠한가요?
It's grey. I'm actually in the English countryside in West Sussex because we're in lockdown and I've been here in my home since March the 12th, working very hard but in one place.
네, 대화로 바로 들어가겠습니다. 코로나19에 대한 대처가 나라마다 차이가 있습니다만 전반적으로 이 세계의 대처 어떻게 평가하십니까?
The variation across countries has been remarkable and some have been much more successful than others. East Asia, the response has been strong and successful. I think because their preparedness was better. I think much of East Asia understood clearly that this was very different from influenza. It was more like SARS, more dangerous, but also particularly infectious. I think much of Europe saw it as like influenza, but even within Europe, you had big differences. There's mixed feeling in the UK about the government's response. I think people recognized that this was a very big threat to our lives. And they were happy at the beginning that the government seemed to be listening to science. So I think it started quite positive in terms of the UK's reaction to government. But then I think there were worries that the personal protection equipment was coming through slowly, that the testing was coming through slowly. And I think when people saw those two problems, they started to worry a bit more. So I think there's still trust in government, but I think those two problems have reduced the trust in government.
한국은 이번 코로나19 대처, 특히 방역과 진단에서 세계의 모범국가로 평가받고 있고 그 덕분에 한국 국민들의 자부심이 많이 높아졌고 정부에 대한 신뢰 또한 높아졌습니다. 한국의 이런 얘기도 스턴경은 듣고 계시는지요?
I think the whole world looks for model, and I think the world looks to South Korea for the model of how to do this well. And I think that as we go into the future and we have to prepare ourselves for these kinds of problems in the future because they will come again, I think people will look to the South Korean model for the lessons of how to handle the next crisis. And so South Korea has done a great service to the world in showing the way forward.
예, 감사합니다. 스턴경의 전문 분야는 아닙니다만 이 코로나19는 언제쯤 진정될까요?
I've actually started to work a lot with the UK government and with other governments on COVID and with the Royal Society and National Academy of Sciences. An enormous amount depends on a vaccine. And if we get a good vaccine that we can spread widely next year, then I think the COVID crisis could end as a medical crisis quite soon. That means sometime next year, not early next year, sometime towards the end of next year, if we have a good vaccine. But if the vaccine does not come through quickly, then I think that the virus, the medical side of the thing, will be with us for quite a long time. The economic consequences will be with us for many years.
예, 내년 말이건 또는 그 다음이건 언젠가는 코로나19 사태가 진정된다면 그 다음에 오는 세계는 어떠한 세계일까요? 지금 전망으로는 비대면 산업 또는 비대면의 인간관계가 확산될 것이다. 이런 전망도 있고 일자리가 많이 사라질 것이다. 하는 전망도 있습니다. 또한 그것 때문에 많은 사람들이 코로나 블루라고 불리우는 고독과 불안 또는 우울을 겪게 될 것이다. 이런 전망이 있는데 스턴경은 어떻게 전망하십니까?
In many ways, that's sad because so much of our life is enjoying ourselves in company. And it's very good that we can talk to each other as we're talking now. But it would also be very nice, you know, to have a cup of tea together or a glass of wine and a meal. And if you look back over history and who we are and our identity, it is actually doing things together that's so important. Eating together in all societies is of fundamental importance. I'm not religious, but I recognize many of my friends who are get great comfort from religious activities together. I'm a big sports fan and I like my football, and we see that too, where people find sense of community, sense of identity. Public celebrations is a huge part of our identity as human beings, and I do think that that's enormously important. Our culture, our theatres, our cinemas, those are enormously important to who we are, how happy we are. So I think that we have to find a way to celebrate those things and bring them back, because I think that a permanent increase in distancing would be a serious damage to our well-being, on our cultural well-being, spiritual, mental health, and so on. That's why it's so important that we stop this virus by care in the first place, and then vaccine. And we hope, of course, treatment as well.
네, 저도 데이비드 베컴을 좋아합니다. 예, 그런데 지금처럼 기업들이 많이 도산하고 세계 무역이 축소된다면 일자리가 줄어들고 사람들이 가난해질 텐데 그런 것을 인류가 견딜 수 있을까요?
I think we're entering a period where government action has to be strong and active in the economy. There are huge new opportunities in building back better, in building more sustainable, inclusive and resilient economies and society. But it will need investment. We need investment in retrofitting homes, in building low carbon infrastructure, in making our cities much more attractive places to be with more walking and cycling. We need to invest in our land. We have degraded our land as a world. We've degraded our water. And of course, we've cut down our forests and we've polluted our oceans. All those things require investment. They require investment in physical capital. So we produce our energy differently. We produce our goods in different ways. That's investment in capital. There's so many new skills that we need. That's investing in people. And we have to, human capital, we sometimes say, and it's also very important to invest in our natural capital. If you look at those three things, physical, human, natural, there are enormous investment opportunities. It does mean doing things differently. It does mean government policy to encourage those new investments. But when you look at those new investments, they're very exciting, full of opportunity, full of productivity, full of waste reduction, full of healthier ways of producing and consuming. So I see this change that has begun towards more sustainable economies as something which is very pro-employment, very pro-inclusion, and a much better way of living, with cities where you can move and cities where you can breathe, and ecosystems which are robust and fruitful. So I see this new direction as enormously exciting. It is a story of growth, but it's a story of much better growth. It's a story of well-being increasing right across the board. But it will need strong government action to encourage this change, because it's major change. And private sector is involved, it is investing, but we have to set the right investment and financial environment and climate for that investment to push ahead with the pace which we need.
네, 스턴경께서 기후 위기 대응에는 정치적 결단이 필요하다고 강조하고 하시는데 조금 전에 그 설명이 바로 정치적 결단에 관한 것인가요?
Yes, it is about political leadership, but of course, politicians and the people interact with each other. So it needs the people to say this is where we want to go, and at the same time, the politicians can say this is where we will lead you.
말씀하신 코로나 시대 이후의 새로운 투자들 이것이 조금 전에 간략하게 언급을 하셨습니다만 오히려 일자리를 늘릴 수도 있고 인간의 삶의 질을 더 높일 수 있을 것이다 하는 말씀은 절망에 빠져 있는 인류에게 큰 희망을 주실 수 있다고 생각합니다. 그걸 좀 많은 시민들에게 좀 설명해 주실 수 있겠습니까?
Physical investments we need to make are big investments in efficiency. That varies very much across countries, but in the UK, our houses are extremely inefficient and they lose lots of heat, and that is a kind of investment and activity that will be extremely important. So that will be, if you like, local building activity to improve homes, and there'll be lots of work there. Also, there will be strong activities around electricity, because electricity is going to play a much bigger role in our economies than before. We will electrify a lot of transport, and that will require more electricity. And of course, that's vital that electricity is renewable, it's clean. So there'll be big new activities in housing, big new activities in electricity. There will be very important advances on the digital front. That will be absolutely central, because so much of this problem is about managing systems. We have to manage our cities, we have to manage our transport, we have to manage our power. Indeed, we have to manage our natural environment in ways that require a lot of information and quick reaction. So those are, I go on, but those are important examples. Homes, there'll be a tremendous amount of new job opportunities there. Investing in land will be extremely important. As a world, we have been reckless with our land. We have invested in agriculture in ways which have degraded the soil. In a sense, we've been soil mining. We've been taking out the quality of the soil. In many cases, we've been poisoning our waterways, and we've been cutting down our trees. So there's a tremendous amount of investment in land, and that is land and water and so on. And that has got tremendous opportunities.
네, 투자가 필요하다는 말씀은 충분히 이해가 됩니다만은 그 투자를 위한 돈은 어디서 가져와야 됩니까? 국민들이 세금을 내기도 어려워질 것이고 국채를 발행해서 적자 재정을 확대하기도 쉽지가 않을 텐데요. 재원은 어떻게 마련해야 됩니까?
Most of the investment will be private sector investment. So it's a question of getting the policies clear. If the government sets a really strong sense of direction, this is the way our cities will move, this is the way our power sector will move, this is the way our agriculture will move, and they set the right incentives, that would include a price for carbon. It would also include regulations to say that coal has to be driven out of the system. It will include standards for buildings. It will include management of traffic in cities. So all these different ways of setting a sense of direction and incentives will be very important. And if those are clear and strong and predictable, then the investment will be there. And so we should see this as a public-private cooperation on a really big scale. The governments will have to set a clear sense of direction, and it will have to be a sense of direction which looks 20 and 30 years ahead, because the investments that are necessary are investments that will last a long time. At the same time, that finance for the private sector has to come through in a way that manages risk well, because a lot of infrastructure projects, a lot of investment projects are quite risky in the first 5 years as you solve your problems at the beginning, the problems of land acquisition and regulation and early technological issues. So we have to manage that risk in the early years of the project. So the finance side is going to require a combination of development banking and of private sector banking, and with the government being willing to take some of the risks. Korea, of course, has a long tradition of development banking with the Korean Development Bank, which has done a very good job. So my first answer to your question is to focus on the private sector, focus on what's necessary to pull the investment through, and then focus on private finance. Because the world as a whole has lots of savings. That's why interest rates are so low. Yeah? The whole world has lots of savings, and there are lots of investment opportunities. But the challenge is to turn the investment opportunities into real projects and to bring the right kind of finance in the right place at the right time. And that's why it's so important for both sides of this, the investment side and the finance side, for government and private sector to work together. There'll need to be some government investment, but I would put first and foremost a private investment story.
스턴경께서 주신 말씀 많은 영감을 저희들에게 주셨습니다. 그런데 스턴경께서 한국 사회의 특수성을 이해하시고 계실지 모르겠습니다만은 한국은 민간에 돈이 남으면 그 부동산으로 그 돈이 몰려서 집값이 나고 춤을 추고 그래서 많은 사람들이 상실감을 느끼고 그렇습니다. 그런 자금들이 바람직한 산업의 방향으로 흘러들어가면 좋을 텐데 혹시 조언을 주실 수 있는지요?
I have to say we have exactly the same problem in the UK, and you find, why is that the case? I think it's about risk management. So if a bank lends for property, then it has the collateral. If everything goes bad, it can take the property. So the bank sees the risk as being reduced because of the direct collateral. And I think what we have to do is make industrial investment less risky. And if industrial investment is less risky, then I think the high returns that can be found there will attract the capital. So I think that it's important to think about how you do that. And that comes back really to my earlier answer. Clear, strong policy will make that investment less risky. And good finance, where a development bank and the public sector can take some of the early stage risk. So the first part of my answer is to make industrial investment less risky. And that's public policy around the investment, and it's public policy and development banking around the finance side. So I think my answer would be make other investment less risky and tax property properly. I know that's difficult to do. People never like paying taxes on their home, but that's where their services come, and that's where their big capital gains come. So I do think taxing property more effectively is an important part of the economy of the next 20, 30, 40 years.
부동산이 안정이 되고 그 자금이 바람직한 산업의 방향으로 흘러 들어갈 수 있다는 것을 저희들도 잘 알고 있습니다. 쉽지는 않습니다만 스턴경의 조언대로 노력하도록 하겠습니다. 스턴경께서 재무부 차관으로 일하시던 시절 2003년부터 2007년까지입니다. 그 당시에 이 사회보장 비율 지출을 GDP의 20% 수준으로 유지를 했고 보건 분야의 비중을 점점 높여갔습니다. 그런데도 그 당시에 경제 성장률이 상당히 높게 달성이 됐거든요. 보통은 복지 비율을 올리거나 보건 분야의 지출을 올리면 경제 성장이 낮아질 것으로들 분석합니다만은 스턴경의 수완으로 가능했는지 오히려 경제 성장률이 높게 달성됐거든요. 어떠한 비결이 있었습니까?
I think one thing is you have to remember that those were slightly easier times. This was the period which was after the dot-com bubble crisis around the turn of the century and before the financial crisis. So we have to recognize that across the world things were looking more promising. So we shouldn't try to take all the credit for the UK. That was looking back, it was quite an unusual period, right between the dot-com crisis and the great financial crisis, where it seemed a little easier to do well. But I hope part of the story was around the idea that we must invest as a nation and as a world in people. See, we usually think of social security as protection. And it is important. It's very important for society to protect people from difficulties in the labour market or health and so on. But at the same time, it's enormously important to think of opportunity and investment in people. We often think of the story of inequality. That's, of course, a large measure what social security is about, as something that happens after people have earned whatever incomes they're going to earn. So we think of it as a redistribution story, if you like, a post-production story. But I think we have to think of inequality much more as a pre-production story. We have to think of productivity, investment in people, a fairer society as all part of the same thing. And health is investing in people, education is investing in people. So I think when we think of both growth and inequality together, we mustn't separate them. We should think of growth and inequality and the environment all coming together if we do the right thing. It won't be that we have to have growth or greater equality. It won't be that we have to have growth or the environment. If we get this right, then we put all three together, and investing in people, investing in our human capital will be a very important part of that. So I hope my answer to your question is partly it was good luck because that period was a relatively easy period in the world, but also I hope we began to see the importance of investing in people and the importance of course, entrepreneurship so that people can use the talents that they have acquired in a strong way.
예, 그 사람에 대한 투자가 얼마나 경제에도 중요한 영향을 주는지에 대해서 좋은 말씀을 해주셨습니다. 기후변화에 대한 평가가 잘못됐다, 과소평가했었다 하는 지적을 하셨습니다. 어떤 뜻이었습니까?
I think in 2007, the understanding of the risk of climate change was not yet strong. If you think of the way in which our education in schools has been in the last 10 years, now I'm a university teacher and all our students now would arrive at our university, the London School of Economics, knowing something about climate change because they've learnt it at school. But back in 2007, there wasn't much public discussion and there wasn't much education around climate change. So you had to begin, as it were, by helping people learn science. Myself, when I was given this task, science. Now I'm myself, when I was given this task by the Prime Minister and Gordon Brown, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, to look at the economics of climate change, I had to spend some time deepening my own knowledge. Of course, I had some about climate change, but I had to spend some time with the scientists deepening the knowledge. And once you start to do that, once you start your own education, you realize just how huge those risks are. And, you know, when we talk about 3 degrees centigrade above of average global surface temperature above the 19th century, it doesn't sound very much. But if you ask the question, what does it mean for the world as a whole? Well, you have to recognize that we have not been there for 3 million years. 3 million years. There's nothing in human experience that can tell us about that. It would involve big areas of the world becoming uninhabitable, from temperature extremes, from violent extreme weather events, from sea level rise, and so on. And of course, we've had years of the, or 12, 13 years since it was published, of these extreme weather events. And that is just on 1 degree centigrade. We're 1 degree centigrade now. I mean, imagine what 2 or 3 would look like. So I think the ideas have changed through education, public discussion, leadership, thought, but to some extent, because we're already experiencing, even at 1 degree centigrade, some very tough effects of climate. So those were early days, but I do think people understand the issues much better now, and they're insisting on action, particularly our young people. And I really celebrate the way in which the young people have picked up and understood and are demanding action.
예, 이 한국도 결코 예외가 아니고 오히려 기후 위기를 더 많이 겪고 있는 곳 가운데 하나가 되어 있습니다. 특히 해수면 상승은 우리 한반도가 훨씬 더 지구 평균보다 높게 올라가고 있는 것이 사실입니다. 그리고 가뭄이나 홍수, 산불, 태풍 이러한 일들이 거의 매년 반복되는 현상을 겪고 있습니다. 그래서 기후 위기를 이제 국민들도 많이 실감하게 됐습니다. 특히 최근에는 이 코로나19도 결국은 배경 가운데 하나가 기후 변화가 아니냐 하는 자각을 사람들이 갖게 됐는데요. 자, 이거 기후 위기에 대한 대응이 필요하다고는 하지만 막상 실천하기는 쉽지가 않은 문제 아닙니까? 제가 총리로 일하던 시절에 녹색성장위원회라는 그 위원회의 위원장을 맡은 적이 있었습니다. 그런데 늘 온실가스 배출, 탄소 배출을 줄이자고 하는 요구와 기업에 너무 큰 부담을 준다 하는 주장 사이에 항상 충돌이 있었고요. 그래서 정부의 정책은 그 둘 사이를 어정쩡하게 조정하는 식으로 이루어지곤 했습니다. 그런데 스턴경께서는 만약에 그런 상황이 온다면 어떻게 조정을 해야 한다고 생각하십니까?
We have birds now meeting in the Bering Straits, which would not have met before. And that is a place, a circumstance where new viruses can develop, and some of them will be nasty. And if you look back, you know, we've had bird flu and swine flu and Ebola and HIV/AIDS and MERS and SARS and now COVID-19. And they're all associated with the interactions between wild animals, domestic animals, and human animals in some shape or form. So we have made these kinds of pandemics more likely. And it's very important to recognize this as a statement that nature is giving to us about what we're doing to the natural world. Now, turning to the story of action on climate and growth, that has been transformed. It is now the case that renewables, including storage, right across much of the world, are a cheaper form of power, even without a carbon price. Now, of course, we do need a carbon price because people should be discouraged from damaging the environment through emissions. We do need that. They're not paying the costs of their actions if we have no carbon price. But it is remarkable how technology has changed. And the costs now are such that going renewable, including storage, is cheaper. There will be some places where it's still going to be more expensive for some time. Air travel and sea travel, we are not fully got the breakthroughs that we need yet. It's moving quickly in steel and cement. We're starting to see the breakthroughs. But those hard to abate sectors, particularly air travel, sea travel, steel, cement, there we need to see much more technical progress. But that is coming, and they're starting to move very quickly. So that narrow trade-off, which people saw, say, 12, 13 years ago, that question has been transformed. The drive to zero carbon is the growth story of the 21st century. That doesn't mean it's easy. It doesn't mean it will just come automatically. It will not. It will need strong policy. But we have to see it now as not only something which we must do for our children and grandchildren, but something that's enormously attractive. But it requires strong public policy, strong leadership, and strong leadership within industry and finance as well.
예, 스턴경께서 지금 한국 사회에 매우 중요한 말씀을 해주셨습니다. 예, 한국 사회에는 아직도 재생에너지에서 나오는 전기를 쓰면 전기요금이 올라갈 것이다 하는 생각이 많습니다. 특히 원전보다 재생에너지가 더 비싸다 하는 생각들이 있고요. 그런데도 불구하고 우리 스턴경께서는 재생에너지가 오히려 더 전기요금을 싸게 할 것이다. 그리고 탄소제로가 오히려 성장을 촉진할 수 있다. 이런 말씀을 주셨는데 한국인들에게 그런 확신을 심어주기 위해서라도 좀 더 설명해 주시겠습니까?
If you look around the world at auctions for supply from the private sector for electricity and for round-the-clock electricity, right across the world, country after country, you're seeing those auctions come in with renewables being cheaper than fossil fuels. In the UK, the cost of offshore wind has really come down very strongly. So the renewable energy story is a very big part, but the efficiency story and the design of our cities and the way we use resources is also extremely important. And that is, we have a tremendous amount to gain. So if we pursue this story of a much more sustainable, environmental friendly economy, we make the right investments, including in the skills and in the land, we will see actually a much more efficient, much more productive economy. So I think that this is the productivity story of the coming years. And Korea has such a strong tradition in technology now that I think that Korea is already a fundamental leader here, not only in the digital side that's so important, but we're starting to see, of course, in hydrogen as well, which you know very well. I think Korea is, as it has been for some time, is going to be a technological leader here. But of course, there's a whole new set of technological opportunities around different ways of doing things, around ways of doing things much more efficiently. That I think Korea will be a tremendous leader over this next 20 years.
네, 저희 한국 정부는 이번 코로나 위기를 극복하는 방법의 하나로서 한국판 뉴딜을 제창하고 있습니다. 그 하나는 디지털 뉴딜, 디지털 전환을 위한 기반을 마련하는 것이고요. 또 하나가 그린뉴딜입니다. 그린뉴딜은 2050년까지 탄소 배출, 온실가스 배출을 네트 제로로 만들겠다는 목표입니다. 아직 시간이 많이 남아있기 때문에 모르지만 일부에서는 그 목표가 달성될 수 있을까 하고 의심하는 사람들도 있습니다. 우리 한국에 조언을 해주신다면 어떤 말씀을 하시겠습니까?
I think the zero by 2050 target is a very clear message from the science. If we are to achieve the goal of holding well below 2 degrees, we have to go net zero by 2050 as a world. That gives us some chance of holding to 1.5 degrees centigrade. So that's the most important thing to begin with. And then clarity on that target will draw through the technical progress as we've been discussing, because people will see, yes, that's where we're going, that if we try to do anything different, our assets will become stranded. They will become out of date. And we must act now to stop our assets going out of date. We must invest in the technologies of the 21st century, not in the technologies of the last century, because that will give you stranded assets are stranded jobs. So clarity on the target and the recognition that if you try to fight against it as an investor, you're going to be very risky and you're going to lose your money and lose the jobs. So that's the very important sort of clarity in that to start with. But let me go back. That's, as it were, the drive over the next 30 years. Then we have to see that this next 10 years or 15 years is crucial. The 20s, how we go from 2020 to 2030 is crucial, because if we invest badly, if we invest in dirty, high carbon assets, we will lock in those emissions. So the emissions will be high and we will run into the stranded assets. So we'll be doing badly economically and badly environmentally over these next 10 years if we invest in the old ways. So that's a fundamental step in the argument. But let me move to the next 1 or 2 years. Yeah, I've started with 2050 and I've said that means we have to be very strong 2020, 2030. But this next 1 or 2 years, the recovery from COVID, we see when we look at the sustainable investments we need to make, we see that many of them can be done quickly, many of them are labor intensive, and many of them have strong economic multipliers that they create activity elsewhere in the economy.
네, 그런데 노동 집약적 산업은 점점 침체하는데 노동 집약적 분야에 투자할 만한 곳이 어떤 곳이 있을지요? 예시할 수 있습니까? 예를 들어 주실 수 있습니까?
I think in making our homes much more efficient, that's labor intensive. I think investing in our land, in trees and restoring degraded land and managing flooding and so on, much better. But those are areas which are really labor intensive. I think, as we discussed earlier, the whole digital sector, which of course is technology, but it's also people and the skills that you need there. Those, I think, are going to be extremely important as well. I think transforming the way our cities function, I mean, making cities more friendly to pedestrians and cyclists involves quite a lot of investment in the management of cities. And of course, we have to recognize that as the proportion of old people in the population rises, and that's true in Korea, it's true in in my own country, we're going to have to spend some resources looking after old people. And the first thing to do, of course, is to keep them at work for as long as possible. The longer that we stay at work, the healthier we are. But at the same time, an aging population requires some personal attention. We can use digital to measure their blood pressure and so on in a more efficient way. But basically, human beings want to see other human beings. That's who we are. So if you look across the story in terms of more sustainable activities, more efficient activities in terms of resources, how our cities work, how our people, then I think you see lots and lots of work opportunities. So I do not see it as technology versus employment. I think I see it as technology working to make our lives better so that we're more productive and we look after each other in better ways.
스턴경께서 아시는 바와 같이 IMF나 OECD 같은 국제기관에서는 올해와 내년도 세계 경제 전망을 매우 어둡게 보고 있고, 그러나 한국은 그 중에서는 꽤 선방할 것이다 하고 전망하지만, 그래도 한국도 올해와 내년에 마이너스 성장을 할 것으로 전망되고 있습니다. 아신 것처럼 한국은 수십 년 동안 고도 성장을 계속해 왔고, 또 고도 성장과 다량의 소비, 또 에너지의 다량 소비, 이를 함께 누려왔습니다. 그런 한국 국민들께 갑자기 경제 성장이 떨어진다, 경제가 속도가 둔화된다는 것은 매우 큰 고통으로 다가올 것입니다. 이렇게 저성장 시대를 사는 인간들의 지혜에 대해서 혹시 조언을 해주시겠습니까?
Korea, of course, is worried about negative growth rates of somewhere between 2 and 3%, but that's still much better than almost everywhere else in the world. In the UK, the growth rate this year will probably be minus 9 or 10%. And I think the first thing we have to worry about is employment. And if people are unemployed for a long time, they lose their skills, their mental health suffers, their physical health suffers. If young people don't get into work soon after they leave university, if they're out of work for some time, that experience damages their prospects for a very long period of time. So I do think that in this year, this very, very difficult year, and of course into next year, employment should be fundamental importance. So the first thing in the rescue is to try to keep people in work. Even if it means some firms might be making losses, the government should be trying to help them through that period so that employment can be maintained. And of course, self-employed is a very important part of that story as well. But as we move more strongly into recovery, I think it's very important to go for jobs which have a future. So invest in the kind of new skills that we've described. This is a moment where if young people would otherwise be unemployed, invest more in the training of young people. Don't let the young people stay out of work for very, very long. So if you're out of work for 6 months or whatever it might be, we will guarantee you a training of some macro economy starts to pick up. The younger people will have spent that time not doing nothing, but being trained for the jobs of the future. So if you're going to invest more in training, if you're going to invest to help firms suffer loss of profits while they keep people at work, that means you're going to have to have public sector deficits for some time. So we have to recognize that this is a period, excuse me, this is a period of 2 or 3 years where, maybe more actually, maybe 3, 4, 5 years, where we're going to have to accept public deficits in order to grow out of this, because we must grow out of this at the same time as we maintain employment and invest in training. So this is a crucial period for bold and strong public policy. And I think it's 3, 4, 5 years like this. I would not try to close public sector deficits in 1 or 2 years, or even perhaps in 5 years. If you're thinking about the public finances, take at least a 10-year view. And I think one mistake we made in the UK after the slowed our growth rate dramatically. It meant we had less investment in skills, less investment in the care homes and so on, and our medical side than we should have done. So I think this is a moment to invest in employment, invest in training, think about the skills of the future. Don't worry too much about public sector deficits. The way in which you bring down your debt to GDP ratio is to grow GDP. Go for the growth. And this is a period where it's extremely important. And it's otherwise, particularly, it's going to be the younger generation who suffer from this.
네, 스턴경, 우리가 약속했던 시간이 거의 다 됐습니다. 욕심 같아서는 몇 시간 동안 모시고 계속 여쭙고 싶습니다만 약속 시간이 다 됐습니다. 끝으로 우리 한국 국민들께도 공유했으면,께서도 공유하셨으면 싶은 프란치스코 교황의 말씀을 이렇게 스턴경께 말씀드리면서 그 프란치스코 교황께서 말씀하시기를 God always forgives. Human beings sometimes forgive. Nature never forgives. 신은 언제든지 용서한다. 인간은 가끔 용서한다. 자연은 결코 용서하지 않는다. 이 말씀을 저는 굉장히 좋아합니다.
Yes, he's a wonderful communicator and a great leader. And he also said, "Will destroy us. If we destroy creation, creation will destroy us." And so he has seen this whole story very early. And we need great communication. We need great leadership. And he's one of the people that gives it. But I would look for, as a European, I would look for leadership and creativity from South Korea. It is quite extraordinary how South Korea has led in technology. It's quite extraordinary how the young people of South Korea now are amongst, and indeed the not so young, are amongst the better trained in the world. Now, you've invested in technology, but you've also invested in people. And I think that is an enormously important lesson. And you've also taught us as a world how to manage health crisis. Your performance on the health crisis in terms of keeping the deaths down, in terms of opening up the economy, being able to open up the economy earlier, has been a very powerful lesson for the rest of the world. And I think the way that Korea goes on the environment, as it comes out of this COVID crisis, will be a very important lesson for the rest of the world. We want to be able to say, here are the benefits of building back better. Here are the benefits of sustainable and inclusive growth. Look at what Korea is doing. They're showing, just as they showed in managing the COVID crisis, they're showing how we can do better, and follow them in terms of the way in which they're coming out of this crisis in a strong, sustainable, inclusive and resilient way. And I think there's so many ways in which Korea can lead, and I'm sure that you will be influencing that story in a very strong way. So it's been a privilege to talk to you, and thank you very much.
스턴경 감사합니다. 오늘 말씀이 힘들어하는 한국 국민들께 크나큰 격려가 됐습니다. 앞으로 한국 국민들께 스턴경의 말씀을 전달하겠고, 앞으로도 귀한 말씀 듣고 한국 국민들께 확산할 기회를 주셨으면 좋겠습니다. 오늘 감사합니다.
I'd be very happy to. I've always enjoyed my visits to South Korea, and as soon as it's possible to start traveling again, it would be very good that we could meet and talk in person. And thank you so much for this very interesting, thoughtful hour. I've enjoyed it enormously. Thank you.
감사합니다.
Thank you. Thank you. Goodbye. Thank you.
I'd like to congratulate former Prime Minister I낙연 and Lord Stern at the conclusion of this global dialogue. In recent weeks, we've seen an intensification of interest amongst Korea's political leaders and among members of the Korean National Assembly in the climate change crisis. And I'm grateful to Prime Minister Lee for his effort to sustain this focus. As UN Secretary-General Guterres has made clear, the COVID-19 recovery must go hand in hand with positive climate action. Now is the time to act. We would like to see Korea join us in taking a leadership role in the global response to the climate crisis, just as it's shown political leadership in tackling COVID-19. I hope this dialogue will inspire people who hear it to think about how they too can join the effort to build a sustainable and climate resilient future together. Thank you.